Psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin are a hallucinogenic class of drugs, which means that they profoundly affect perception, cognition, and mood. What's known as classical psychedelics are compounds that primarily activate certain receptors in the brain, called serotonin receptors. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter, a chemical in the brain that regulates numerous biological processes. Psilocin and LSD have chemical structures similar to serotonin. This allows them to sort of pretend to be serotonin, attach to the receptors that normally are designed for serotonin, and activate them. Psychedelics have been said to produce a dreamlike state. This can be described as a disruption in logical thinking, altered perception and sense of self and time, emotional shifts, and changes in visual, auditory, and physical sensory perceptions. How psychedelics produce these changes in cognition and perception isn't fully understood, largely because as a Schedule I drug, legal barriers have made scientific research on this more difficult. But more research is being done now because it seems there's also a therapeutic potential in psychedelics. But first, let's look at how they cause hallucinations. We now know that psychedelics primarily induce their psychological effects via a certain kind of serotonin receptor, called the 5-HT2A receptor. It's thought that the certain domino of effects that happens after these psychedelics activate this receptor is what modulates downstream signaling pathways to ultimately give rise to the hallucinogenic experiences. It's thought to all start in the prefrontal cortex, which is a brain region known to be involved in high-level cognition and emotional processes. It's here that the 5-HT2A receptors get targeted by psychedelics. A prominent theory is that the process also involves the thalamus, which is known as the gateway to the cortex, since sensory information from the external world, like sight, taste, touch, and smell, is filtered and relayed by the thalamus before being processed and integrated into the cortex. This becomes a loop because then the cortex provides feedback to the thalamus to adjust the flow of information. When the 5-HT2A receptor in the prefrontal cortex is activated, it causes more release of another neurotransmitter called glutamate. This increase in glutamate occurs along the process of where the thalamus relays information to the cortex. So this flood of glutamate interferes with the thalamus being able to filter the sensory information before sending it to the cortex. So without proper gating, the cortex gets information overload in certain regions while reducing information flow to others, ultimately causing increased sensory perception and cognitive disturbances that are seen in the psychedelic state. There are also other components, like the observation that psychedelics increase excitation of the visual pathway. The visual pathway processes external input, but hallucinations are visual alterations in the absence of external input. So exciting and amplifying internally driven signals may be what underlies the hallucinogenic experience. Though we don't have the full picture yet, it's likely a combination of these effects and many more. Overall though, psychedelic-induced hallucinations seem to be from a disbalance between perception and integration. It's pretty exciting that psychedelics may have therapeutic potential for treating psychiatric disorders. Psychiatric disorders like major depressive disorder and anxiety are complicated because different people can respond really differently to the same treatments. And some cases are even labeled treatment-resistant because the therapeutics we currently have available just aren't effective for them. This is why looking at other avenues and strategies of therapeutics targeting psychiatric disorder symptoms is gaining traction. Early results from psychedelic studies in humans suggest that the 5-HT2A receptor is specifically important for modulating social functioning, mood regulation, and self-representation. So it may be that psychedelics are able to alter emotion processing so that it normalizes the negative bias symptomatic of depression. We don't quite know the mechanism of how that works, but here's one hypothesis. Remember glutamate? It's a neurotransmitter associated with learning and memory because it basically allows the growth and reorganization of neural networks. Research suggests that the glutamate increase seen with psychedelics promotes the adaptations of growth and reorganization among neurons, which is known to be disrupted in depression and anxiety. Without neural adaptations, you can't appropriately adjust and respond to environmental stressors, likely contributing to depressive symptoms. So why we might see symptom improvements with psychedelics may be because of how they increase glutamate to promote these adjustments among neurons. The hope is to be able to dissociate what the therapeutic component is from the hallucinogenic component to develop novel, effective therapeutics. But there's still so much we don't know, like the exact mechanisms and the long-term effects, questions that will hopefully be answered with continued research.